Hi everyone, this is Grandmaster Eugene Perelshteyn, and together with chesslecture.com, I'd like to welcome you to another of my lectures. Today we want to talk about the recent game between Ivanchuk and Topalov in round 2 of the Linares tournament. And this is a beautiful game in the Najdorf Sicilian that Ivanchuk won. So let's start. E4, C5, knight f3, D6, D4, CD, takes, this is all theory, knight f6, knight c3, A6. So Topalov is playing black, he chooses the Najdorf variation, and Ivanchuk plays bishop E3. Again, still unclear what white wants to do after e5, either knight b3 or knight f3. So Topalov plays e5. And now Ivanchuk plays a very solid and positional move, knight f3. So not long ago, everybody used to play knight b3. And of course, this could still transpose to the English attack after queen d2 and castle long. But recently, in a couple of years, everybody started to play knight f3 with a positional idea of bishop c4. So this is the main idea of knight f3. So let's see what Topalov does. Bishop e7. Now some of you might ask, is knight g4 a threat? Well, if you look at the position, Black has made only one development with his piece, the knight, and now he is about to trade it off for the bishop, whereas White just made 3 development moves. So really any move for White is good. Bishop g5, hitting the queen, queen d2, preparing to recapture with the queen, and then knight d5, and bishop c4, and maybe castle even long. So yeah, knight g4 is not a big deal. And Black should develop his piece as fast as possible. Bishop e7 is the right move. And now bishop c4. Castles. Castles. And now Topalov plays bishop e6. He really wants to trade the light square bishop on c4. And now Ivanchuk takes. And pawn takes. So let's stop and take a look at this position for a second. Black has very powerful center pawns. D6, E6, and E5. The E6 pawn is covering the D5 square, so White can't play the typical knight D5. But in reality, these pawns are also a weakness because of various ideas such as knight G5, or double on the d file, and the d6 pawn is weak. So let's see how Ivanchuk takes advantage of this awkward pawn structure. Knight a4. Exclam. You might ask, well, isn't he just giving up the pawn on e4? Well, let's take a look. Knight takes e4. Knight b6, hitting the rook. Rook a7. And now a very powerful move, knight d5. Hitting the rook, and at the same time, if pawn takes knight, queen takes, check, and then the knight's going to be hanging. And if rook back, now bishop b6, another tempo move on the queen. And now you can see that after queen d7 or queen e8, simple knight c4 gives White at least an extra rook. So let's go back. Now let's take a look. What's the idea behind knight a4? So knight b6 is the main idea, and how can Black defend against that? So what if, you might ask, knight bd7? Well, now the problem, the e6 pawn, knight g5. And you see there is no way to defend the e6 pawn. So Topalov decides to attack the e3 bishop with knight g4, which is a plausible idea. And now Ivanchuk simply plays queen d3, defending the bishop. Now knight takes, queen takes. So let's take a look at this position. The main threat is still knight b6. And now there is another threat looming in the air, queen b3, hitting the 2 pawns on e6 and b7. Again, black is faced with unpleasant choices. How to continue his development and at the same time protect against these 2 threats. So Topalov chooses the active plan on b5, and really there is no other move that would do justice to black's position. And now knight b6, hitting the rook, and rook a7. Now, during the analysis of this game, an interesting idea occurred to me. What if rook takes f3, temporarily using that the queen is defending the knight, pawn takes, and bishop g5. But if you look at this position carefully, especially with the computer, you notice that a very powerful move f4 is present here. And the main idea is to lure the bishop to f4 and open up the queen to h3. And now after queen h3, queen takes knight, queen takes e6, king f8, simple move, rook d1, gives white overwhelming advantage, if not winning position right away. There is no stopping rook takes d6, the king is wide open, the knight is still on b8, the position is just dead lost for black. So as you see, this nice little trick, rook f3, doesn't work because of f4. So okay, rook a7, that's what Topalov plays. And now is where we really see the genius of Ivanchuk. He plays knight d5, hitting the rook, rook b7, and now a quiet move and very, very powerful move, queen d2. Notice that you can't take the knight because of queen takes, hitting the rook with check. So queen d2 is a multi-purpose move. First of all, you're preparing to play rook d1, hitting the bishop, and then winning the d6 pawn. At the same time, it's really hard for black to make any useful move. So what could black try to do? Well, taking the knight is impossible. Moving the king maybe. How about moving the king out of check? Well, that's possible. And now, white has several choices. Probably the easiest is simply to take on e7, queen takes, and then play either rook f2 d1 or rook a2 d1, and simple plan of queen b4, double up, and this 6 pawn is really backwards here. So let's see what Topalov plays. He plays knight c6. He has to get out with the knight somehow. Now, after knight c6, let's take a moment and see how white can continue his attack. Well, the easiest move is rook a d1, follow up with the plan, and that's what Ivanchuk plays. Again, notice that you can't take the knight on d5. If pawn takes knight, queen takes, check, king h8, queen takes e6, And now black's position just collapses because not only is he down a pawn, but after rook c7, his whole queenside pawns fall. And white just has a couple extra pawns, an easy win. So what to do for Topalov? Well, not an easy choice, but he plays rook d7. He's got to defend against knight d7 somehow. And again, here is when most players would finally say, okay, now is the time to take the bishop, but not Ivanchuk. He is very good with keeping his position and keeping pressure on his opponent and keep making these very powerful, small, pinpoint-like moves with his queen. So queen c3, hitting the knight. Again, pawn takes knight is bad because queen c6. Takes e4, queen takes, or even better, knight e5. Immediately closing the game down, because if takes, then rook takes d7 simply wins, or queen takes d7. If rook moves, then queen d5 and knight f7, the game is over. So you see, this queen c3 is a very powerful move. And again, what to do for black? So notice the lesson here. With every move that white does, he's creating threats. So it's not so easy for black to defend. So Topalov finally decides to put his knight back to b8. And now is the perfect time to take the bishop. So knight takes e7. Queen takes e7. So we reach this position that we can basically evaluate as a slightly better for white, because white has a very simple plan. Double up on the d file, put pressure on the d6 pawn, and then create a second weakness on the queen side with a4. So let's see how the game continues. So queen takes e7, rook e3, rook d3, simple continuation with his plan, h6, trying to create some kind of window for the king. Now, rook fd1, of course, and Topalov plays rook fd8. Really, his position is so passive and the weakness on d6 is so apparent that it's hard for him to create any counterplay whatsoever. So now white did exactly what he wanted. He doubled up on the d file. He pinned down all of black's pieces to defend the d6 pawn. What's next? Here is when you really understand the position. You have to sort of look at the whole board, not just the d6 pawn. Notice that white just has a lot of space. a6, b5 pawns are going to be weak after a4. Knight on b8 is misplaced. So really, all of these are long-term weaknesses that black has, are not so easy to get rid of. So that's why Ivanchuk plays very correctly and very prophylactical move h4. This is typical grandmaster move in positions like that. It basically shows to your opponent, look, I can do whatever I want. I can make all the best moves to better my pieces, whereas your position just sucks. And so let's see what Topalov does. After h4, he has to play king h7. Not has to, but he doesn't have that much choice. He has to do something. And now, after king h7, let's take a look at the position and see what Ivanchuk does. This is not an apparent move, and only very strong players can see this move. Rook 1 to d2. The simple idea is to keep the pawns protected on the second rank in case black plays rook c7. Now you can play either queen b4 or queen a5, and now the rook is defending the c2 pawn. Now, of course, there are other helpful moves besides rook d2, but rook d2 is the kind of quiet, tough move that black doesn't really know how to react against. So Topalov is looking for counterplay. So let's see what he can do. He decides to activate his queen. Queen f8. He's got to do something. And Ivanchuk correctly... Now the queen on c3 doesn't really belong there. So Ivanchuk correctly places on the right square queen b3. At the same time, he has to pin the other queen to e6 pawn, because you don't want to activate the queen going to f4, g4, or any other square. So now queen e8, he's pinned the queen, the two rooks, and the knight is now placed. Then what? Well, then, the typical example, in these types of positions, you've got to create the second weakness. And the second weakness comes on the queen side, a4. Very, very strong move. And now black's position is on the verge of collapse. Again, after a4, it's not so easy for black to play. Because if you take on a4, notice that what happens. We just created a second weakness to an a6. Pawn on d6 is really weak. And now white can do whatever he wants. He can play b3, c4, and then b4. So many plans. And black's position is just very, very bad. And Topalov knows that he's going to suffer through and eventually lose without any counterplay. So what he does, he embarks on a dangerous plan, but at least it's some counterplay with queen to g6. So let's see if queen g6 works. So Ivanchuk just takes the pawn, and it turns out that taking on e4, maybe as Topalov originally anticipated, doesn't quite work, because queen takes e6, pawn takes b5, and now very beautiful move where the rook on d3, queen on e6, and pawn on h4 play part of. Knight g5 check. Takes, and now black's position is lost. There is no defense against rook h3. If g6, for example, rook h3 check, king g7, it's simply mate, queen f6, and then rook h8. You see this very beautiful mate right out of nowhere, but yet very deadly. So Topalov realized that whatever he did doesn't look that great, so he can't take on e4. He's got to do something, so he takes on b5. Again, very quiet and very strong move, rook e3. The pawn on b5 is not going anywhere, and Chuck is right, because rook b7 simply loses to knight e5. So how do you defend the b5 pawn? Well, you don't, and that's what Topalov actually wanted. He wanted to activate his knight, although he has to give up the b5 pawn. He plays knight a6. So queen takes b5, and now knight c5. Alright, so he finally activated his knight, but it's at the cost. The cost is the pawn. And notice that white has two passers, b2 and c2, and soon it's not going to be easy for black to stop these pawns, at least the b2 pawn. So now after knight c5, simple move, queen c4, everything is defended, rook a7, so Topalov was creating some kind of counterplay at least, and again very calm, and the simple move, rook e1, defending the first rank just in case of any invasions. Now what? The knight on c5 is activated, rook on a7 is activated, but all of white's pieces are defended. White has no weaknesses, and still he has an extra pawn. Whereas black's pawn on d6 is still weak and has to be defended. So Topalov decides to play queen e8 to transfer his queen over. And now b4, finally pushing the pawns. Knight a4 and queen b3. Now rook c8. Actually, sorry, first he played knight b6. And after knight b6, rook fd1, rook ed1, and rook a to d7. So now Ivanchuk did the following. He tied up the rooks again. He misplaced the knight on b6. So part of his plan now is to push the pawn and get the a file as well. So queen d3, with the idea to play queen b5 and put even more pressure on that knight on b6. Rook c8, simple c3, everything is defended. Rook a7. Now taking the d6 pawn is just bad because of knight c4, of course. But queen e3, very powerful move, using the pin to his advantage. Rook a6, queen e2, hitting the rook, knight c4, and now rook a2. Finally winning the a file fight. So rook a c6, Topalov tries to struggle on, tries not to exchange pieces, and now rook a7. Really, really powerful move. Rook is going to be a menace on the 7th rank. So Topalov can't really take that. Rook there for a long time, he has to exchange it. So he plays rook 6 to c7. Now just double up. And here where Topalov makes his final blunder, or the final mistake, queen f7. This is really beautiful because now queen takes c4 completely finishes the game. If rook takes, then rook takes. And now you see this beautiful rook versus queen and rook versus queen crossfire, and black is completely lost. So you see, this game showed us the brilliancy of Ivanchuk, how in a quiet opening he maneuvered his pieces so well to completely limit black's counterplay, and at the same time win a pawn, and then simply, defend all his pieces and maneuver around, win the a file, and Topalov just blundered. So this is a very good example by one of the top players against the former, or you can say the #1 ranked player in the world, or the former world champion, Topalov. Alright, thank you very much, and I hope to see you all next time here. Bye-bye.